For more than half a century, Jeannie Seely stood beneath the bright lights of the Grand Ole Opry, smiling as the crowd cheered her name. To millions, she was a symbol of grace and country music tradition, the woman who never lost her sparkle. But behind that familiar smile was a silence that lasted far too long. Now, at 90, Jeannie is ready to speak. Not about fame, not about music, but about the truth she's carried for a lifetime. Long before Nashville knew her name, Jeannie Seely was just a small-town girl from Titusville, Pennsylvania, with calloused hands and a voice too big for her world. Her father worked at the local steel mill. Her mother scrubbed floors and sang hymns while the radio hummed softly in the background. There were no industry contacts, no rich mentors, just static-filled country stations and a stubborn dream that refused to die. At 16, Jeannie mailed off a set of lyrics to a publishing house in Nashville. She waited by the mailbox for weeks. No reply ever came, but she didn't stop writing. By 21, she packed a small suitcase, a half-used typewriter, and enough determination to power a freight train and headed south. By the time she reached Tennessee, she was nearly broke, but not broken. She worked temp jobs, shared borrowed rooms, and sang wherever anyone would let her. In tiny bars, thick with cigarette smoke, where no one clapped and nobody cared, she kept going. Then one night, everything changed. A man sitting in the back of a dimly lit club slipped her a card after her set. He'd just heard her sing "Don't Touch Me," a song that would soon make her voice echo across the nation. Within months, her name was on the radio. The success came fast. Awards followed along with the money and the interviews, but respect, that took longer. Jeannie didn't fit the mold. She wore short skirts and eyeliner. She cracked jokes and refused to call men sir unless they'd earned it. And most of all, she sang like she meant every word. Her songs weren't delicate heartbreaks. They were firestorms of guilt, desire, and regret. When she first stepped onto the Grand Ole Opry stage, the men backstage warned her, no dancing, no low necklines, no talking back. She smiled politely, then did all three. It wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion, it was survival. Behind the curtain, the men who ran the Opry didn't know what to do with her. She was too talented to cut loose, but too bold to trust. They tried to box her in, gave her bad time slots, paired her with acts that ignored her, whispered things behind her back loud enough for her to hear. But Jeannie kept showing up, night after night. Eventually, she won the crowd's heart and became the first woman ever to regularly host the Grand Ole Opry, a title that should have been a triumph. Instead, it became the year that changed everything, the year she was called to Room 6B. It was early 1971 when everything began to unravel. A spring storm had swept through Nashville, shaking the old Opry house until the walls trembled. The rain came in sheets, the power flickered, and for a brief moment, half the stage went dark. To the audience, it was nothing. Just a momentary glitch before the backup generators kicked in. But backstage, something shifted. Jeannie was wrapping up her set when a stagehand approached her with a folded piece of paper. No words, no explanation. Just a room number and a time. Room 6B, 9:45 p.m. She had never heard of that room before. It wasn't on any of the backstage maps, not listed among the green rooms or rehearsal spaces. Still, there was an unspoken rule at the Opry. When a note like that appeared, you didn't ask questions. You went. She followed the dim corridor past the dressing rooms, past the costume storage, until the noise of the stage faded into silence. The hallway narrowed, colder, older. At the very end stood a door with no nameplate, only a brass knob. Behind it, a faint hum, like static or breath. She hesitated, then turned the handle. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp. One chair, one man. No introductions. He didn't need them. He was one of those quiet figures who never appeared in photos, yet whose word could end careers. The air felt heavy. He looked her over, not with admiration but with assessment, as if calculating how far she could be pushed before breaking. Then came the question, one she's never repeated out loud. It wasn't personal, but it was powerful, and the meaning was clear. Her place at the Opry depended on how she answered. Her voice caught in her throat. The man didn't wait for a response. He leaned forward and delivered his message, not a request, but a warning. Jeannie left the room 11 minutes later, pale, shaking, unable to catch her breath. She walked past the stagehands, past the murmuring crowds, straight into the parking lot. There, under the rain, she took off the blue sequined dress she'd worn that night, her favorite, and set it on fire. A janitor would later tell others that she stood there silently, watching it burn like it was a person. She never wore blue again. After that night, changes in her career became concrete and unmistakable. Her name was omitted from introductions in programs. Her set lists were shortened, removing songs that had previously showcased her range. She was shifted to late-night time slots, once replaced by a male newcomer who forgot half his lines. No apology, no explanation. Backstage, colleagues who once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze. Whispers circulated about her attitude and defiance. Jeannie knew the cause. Room 6B had marked her, and she understood the cost of passing through its door. Still, she performed. She smiled for cameras, shook hands, and stepped on stage as if nothing had happened. Yet every glance down the dim corridor toward that door reminded her of the faint hum she had heard and the man's chilling words, "Careful, sweetheart. You're not untouchable." That night she began writing letters, on hotel stationery, cocktail napkins, scraps of envelopes, recording the precise details of what occurred, who delivered threats, what subtle punishments were imposed, which acts were shuffled around, and how she was reminded of her vulnerability. The letters were folded carefully and stored in a small wooden box, a hidden testament to the manipulations she endured. By the mid-1970s, Jeannie Seely had become a familiar presence at the Grand Ole Opry, known for "Don't Touch Me" and her sequined performances. Behind the curtains, however, she documented the tactics used against her. Abrupt room changes, shifted performance schedules, colleagues avoiding her, and whispered warnings. Her letters detailed names, times, incidents, and conversations, each entry a clear record of intimidation and calculated attempts to keep her in line. In late 1976, she was called again to room 6B, supposedly for schedule updates. No papers were presented, no meetings held. Only the same quiet man awaited, his authority unspoken but absolute. The 11 minutes she spent there cast a shadow over her subsequent shows. Her dressing room was relocated without notice, her stage time was cut, and the backstage atmosphere stiffened. Jeannie's letters meticulously recorded each of these events, providing a precise account of manipulation, intimidation, and the professional consequences she endured. Writing became both her shield and her proof. Clear, undeniable evidence of the risks she faced simply for performing and speaking her mind. After that night, her dressing room was moved without explanation. Her scheduled performances were cut back. The air around her grew cold, filled with polite smiles that hid warning eyes. Those who had once shared jokes with her in the hallway now avoided her gaze. She began to understand the Opry's silent law. Survival depended on silence. Still, she wrote. On hotel stationery, scraps of envelopes, and cocktail napkins, Jeannie poured out everything she couldn't say aloud. Each note, each letter, became a record of what she endured. The manipulation, the punishment, the nights she left the stage in tears, but never let the audience know. She hid those letters in a box, marked only with the year, 1976. Years later, when asked about that period, she simply said, "The Opry taught me two things, how to sing through pain and how to smile when your voice trembles." It was a line that carried far more truth than most ever realized. For years, Jeannie Seeley carried the weight of those letters like a secret scar. They stayed locked away in a small wooden chest, hidden in the corner of her home just outside Nashville. Life went on, at least on the surface. She continued performing, smiling for fans, taking the stage as if nothing had ever happened behind those Opry curtains. But the letters were always there, silent witnesses to a truth she couldn't yet face. By the early 1990s, the Opry had changed. New faces, younger voices, different management. The past seemed buried, or at least that's what everyone wanted to believe. Then, in 1991, disaster struck. A fire broke out at Jeannie's house while she was away for a weekend show in Missouri. The flames tore through her belongings, photographs, costumes, awards, all reduced to ashes and twisted metal. When she returned, the sight was unbearable. Decades of her life gone in hours. But as she sifted through the ruins, something strange happened. Among the charred remains of her closet, the small wooden box had survived. The edges were blackened, but inside, the letters were untouched. The ink still clear, the words still alive. Jeannie never spoke about what was in that box to anyone. She stored it away again, this time in a safer place, and locked it behind a false wall in her attic. The survival of those papers felt like a message, not divine, not mystical, but human. It was as if the truth itself refused to die. The years that followed were quieter. Jeannie continued performing at the Opry, the same building that had once both made and wounded her. She stood on its stage, looking out at the crowds, never letting them see the ghosts behind her smile. The Opry celebrated her as a legend, one of the few women to ever regularly host the show. But no one knew that she still kept those old, yellowed pages, the testimony of what she had endured. And yet, time has a way of circling back. In the late 2000s, long after the names and whispers of Room 6B had faded from public memory, a knock came at Jeannie Seeley's door, a knock that would quietly change the course of her story. It was a cold morning in early 2009. Jeannie, now in her late 70s, opened her front door to see a young woman standing there, notebook clutched tightly, a small recorder in hand. Her name was Claire Montgomery, a graduate student from Vanderbilt University, writing her thesis on the hidden history of women at the Grand Ole Opry. Jeannie's first instinct was caution. She had long grown used to journalists who chased legend and entertainment, not truth. Most would have been satisfied with anecdotes about "Don't touch me" or the glamour of sequined dresses, but Claire was different. Her approach was quiet, meticulous, respectful. She reminded Jeannie of herself at 21, determined, unafraid to dig for facts, and believing that truth could make a difference. They began talking. At first, it was surface level. Music, performances, life at the Opry, the early rules imposed on women. Smile more and speak less. Yet as the hours passed, Claire asked the question Jeannie had avoided for decades. "Miss Seeley," she said softly, almost reverently, "what really happened in Room 6B? The room fell into a silence heavier than any applause Jeannie had ever heard. That name had been buried in her memory for nearly 40 years, unspoken, almost untouchable. The gravity of the question made her chest tighten. For a moment, it seemed impossible that the past could be spoken aloud. Then Jeannie moved with purpose to the attic, returning with the small wooden box she had hidden for decades. Claire watched as she placed it carefully on the table. The lock creaked as it opened. Inside lay dozens of folded letters, each one painstakingly written, each one a piece of history. Dates, names, incidents, and times all meticulously recorded. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink had faded, yet each word still bore Jeannie's trembling handwriting, a tangible testament to fear, defiance, and survival. She did not speak as Claire carefully read each letter. The room was filled only with the quiet rustle of turning paper. When Claire finally looked up, her face pale, she whispered, "You kept all of this?" Jeannie nodded, her eyes steady. "Because they told me no one would believe me." That single act, sharing the box, transformed what had begun as an interview into weeks of detailed conversations. They spoke of silence, of intimidation, of resilience, and of the unspoken costs of being a woman in Nashville's golden era. Claire meticulously documented everything with Jeannie's permission, cross-referencing old Opry rosters, performance schedules, and internal notes. Each new detail, each corroboration, pieced together a narrative that had been carefully buried for decades. By the time Jeannie reached her late 80s, she remained at the Opry, not just as a performer, but as the keeper of a history that had been systematically silenced. She had survived the intimidation, the veiled threats, the manipulated schedules, and the quiet exclusions. But survival alone was never enough. Now, armed with evidence and a witness in Claire, Jeannie sought accountability, to set the record straight for herself, for those who had been silenced, and for the generations of women who would follow. Her decision to speak was deliberate. Quiet interviews, small quotes at tribute shows, subtle mentions in memoirs, each disclosure revealed patterns, not just incidents. Young performers, some unaware of the Opry's history of silencing women, began noticing the inconsistencies and the gaps left by those who had disappeared from the stage too soon. Then came the act that cemented her legacy. The donation of the wooden box, the letters and records she had kept for decades. Placed in a country music archive independent of Opry control, the collection was sealed for public release only if something happened to her. The Opry could no longer claim full control over the story. Even in her final appearances, Jeannie commanded respect. She moved slower, spoke softly, but her gaze carried the weight of experience. Young artists approached her with gratitude, some sharing that her story had given them courage to speak up. One evening, backstage, a young singer whispered, "Thank you for not letting them bury you." That acknowledgement was the quiet triumph Jeannie had always sought. In her 90s, Jeannie was no longer just a performer. She was a witness, a historian, a protector of those who might otherwise have been forgotten. The letters, the stories, the warnings, they were no longer secrets. They were proof, living on in the archives, in whispers among new generations, and in the memory of a woman who refused to vanish quietly. Her final public appearance at the Opry captured this spirit. Standing on the stage that had both made and scarred her, she said, "The truth doesn't fade with time. It just waits for someone brave enough to listen." The curtain fell that night, and the applause lasted not just for the music, but for the courage and steadfast voice of a woman who had finally spoken the story decades of fear could not erase. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so more untold stories like Jeannie's can finally be heard.